I hope my American friends will understand if I tell it the way I see it. And I certainly have been telling my own government in very blunt terms in recent months what I think of them. But that is not the subject today. The first mistake the new president made was to keep or try to keep his election promises. I've never said that to anyone before in my life. And, you know, I know that's a broad statement, but one in particular I think was very unfortunate, and that had to do with the travel ban and lack of issuing visas to citizens of a few countries that happen to have a majority of Muslim citizens. And more about that later. There's so much going on that I will only deal with 4 other major issues: the cabal, the banking cartel, defense expenditures, and global warming. One conclusion I reached, however: it is impossible to even guess what is happening today unless you know what has been happening for the last 3/4 of a century. And I run into quite a few people who have no idea. As early as October 1940, years before Germany surrendered to the Allied armies to vaporize Hitler's vision of empire, the Council on Foreign Relations, headquartered in Washington and New York, had its committee on economic and financial affairs write a memorandum outlining a comprehensive policy, and I'll quote, to set forth the political, military, territorial, and economic requirements of the United States in its potential leadership of the non-German world area, including the United Kingdom itself, as well as the Western Hemisphere, I presume that includes us, and the Far East. The Grand Area, as the non-German bloc was called in 1941, apparently was insufficiently grand, and the preferred ideal was an all-inclusive one-world economy dominated by the United States. It was at this stage that there was a virtual merger of the Council and the U.S. State Department, which, in late 1941, created a special committee to consider positive planning, the Advisory Committee on Positive Foreign Policy, on which council members, that's the members of the Council on Foreign Relations, played important roles and set the stage for key decisions that would affect the post-war world. Well, these were the seeds of a new world order, and they have been working at it ever since. At the end of the war, they got a break with Operation Paperclip. I'm sure that most of you here know about Operation Paperclip, but the US military had their eyes on some of the Nazi scientists and engineers and wanted to get their hands on them before somebody else did. So they got President Truman to agree, but on the condition that they didn't include anyone who has strong Nazi connections. Well, the military, as I know from personal experience, paid no attention to the caveat that the president had applied, and they got a lot of scientists and engineers who had very strong Nazi connections. And they were brought to the United States. CIA gave them new identities and new names, and the new files were paper-clipped to the old files, and that's where the paperclip came from. And then they were given important jobs in both the military and the civil departments of the United States. I sometimes add, I don't know if I've got time to do it today or not, it was kind of ironic. Here was the CIA bringing in German Nazi scientists and engineers on one hand, another group in the CIA out looking for Nazis who had got into the country somehow to throw them out. But that's the way the world works. And just about then, some UFOs crashed near Roswell, New Mexico. And they were, as you well know, this group knows, were not the first crashes, but neither in the United States nor in the world. But it was the first ones that got prominence. And they became a watershed in publicity. In my early days in this business, the first question people would answer me is, do you know about Roswell? And I was pleased to be able to say that I had some small inkling of what had happened there. It was on Tuesday, July the 8th, 1947, at 11 a.m., Mountain Time, that Colonel William Blanchard, commander of the Roswell Army Airfield, put out a press release saying that they had recovered a flying disc. And this was reported in the local papers. That was the truth. Hours later, Brigadier General Roger Ramey said, no, that was a mistake. It wasn't a disc, it was a Rowan weather balloon. And that was a lie. It was not only a lie, and incidentally, I don't think the Brigadier General did it on his own. I think he had been ordered to do it. I read something recently that his wife was very distressed, and he was too, at having to make that decision. But it was a cornerstone lie in what has become a culture of untruths and disinformation. Well, then, as you know, President Truman established MJ-12 with virtually dictatorial powers in respect of UFOs and the ET file. They passed the National Security Act with its provision of right to know, which I really didn't take as seriously for quite a long while as I do now. I think it has been used to screen a lot of people who might otherwise have been in the loop, and to make it very difficult to really find out exactly what has been going on. Meanwhile, the group that was back engineering one of the vehicles captured at Roswell moved to Nevada and set up operations there. And of course, they were secret operations. When General Eisenhower wanted to know what was going on, they refused to tell him. And would you be surprised to know that that didn't please the general? After all, he was the President of the United States and had been the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and to have troops allegedly under his command not telling him what was going on, I think rubbed him the wrong way. So he threatened to send in the First Army from Colorado, and that got their attention. And so they allowed him to send, I think it was 3 or 4, I can't remember which, of his close friends from the CIA to go out and take a look around at, I guess, both Area 51 and S4. And they reported back exactly what was expected, and that was that they were back engineering one of the craft that had crashed near Roswell. And this was really, I think, the experience that led to the general making that famous statement in his last address to the people of the United States, his farewell address, where he said to beware of the military-industrial complex. And what he was really talking about was to beware of the fact that a lot of very highly sensitive things, including the UFO and the ET file, was perhaps in the wrong hands. I wish he'd come out and said that, but I can understand why he didn't. It was what we call political language. And unfortunately, unlike with most prophets, we did not pay any attention to him. We've read the speech many times, we've quoted from it, but no real action was taken. And that, dear friends, is, in my opinion, one of the principal reasons why the world is in such a mess today. Meanwhile, the original Council of Foreign Relations plan, reinforced by Nazi scientists, had picked up some allies. Most important, the Bilderbergers. The Bilderbergers started as a European group and then spread, but they had some noble ideas in the early days. But then they became a self-interest group and the most secretive, and in my opinion, one of the most dangerous secret groups in recent history. Then later, when Japan started to come up, Zbigniew Brzezinski said to David Rockefeller that we should include Japan in some of these things, and so he took that to the Bilderberg meeting, and it was approved, and they came back and set up the Trilateral Commission, and then you had the three. You had the Bilderbergers, the Trilateral Commission, and the Council on Foreign Relations, and in my books, I call them the Three Sisters. Most important, the Bilderbergers and their associates, the Bavarian Illuminati, brought a new dimension to the whole thing. And from that group really came what I and others have called the cabal. They are the apex of the cabal. And they include the banking cartel, because the major bankers of the world are all represented in the Bilderbergers. And then next to them was the oil cartel. And then next to them were the CEOs of the transnational corporations. Then the intelligence agencies, the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, the all-seeing eye, the MI6, the British MI6, and the Israeli Mossad, and more. And then a huge, huge slice of the US military. And together, they have been running the United States and much of the world for decades. And the end game is a new world order, which was announced by George Bush Sr. when he was president. And it sounded like utopia. It sounded like peace and prosperity for everyone in the world forever. And it had a wonderful ring to it. But he must have known, as a former director of the CIA, some at least, and maybe much of the score. And what is really planned is an unelected, totalitarian government of the world. And you can call it what you like. People have called it fascist, they called it Nazi, and recently some people have been calling it the Fourth Reich. And David Rockefeller, a lifelong heavyweight, spilled the beans at a Bilderberg meeting where he said that it would be better off if the world was run by bankers and the elite than it would by these self-elected groups in the democratic system. And I wouldn't use his name if he hadn't confirmed these ideas in his memoirs, where he in fact boasted about the plans that they had made and the success that they had had, helped in large part by organizations like the New York Times, Washington Post, Life, and other important news outlets, which had representatives at the Bilderberg meetings, and which had taken their oath and were playing their game. Well, the cabal learned from Hitler's mistakes. Instead of attacking one country after another and getting the whole world upset and against them and immediately putting up resistance, they decided that that the pen was mightier than the sword, and that their strategy would be a combination of monetary system, the banking system, and trade agreements in order to achieve control. And according to Professor Carol Quigley, Bill Clinton's mentor at Georgetown University, the cabal's plan is the brainchild of a clique of international financiers. Quigley wrote in Tragedy and Hope in 1964, and I would like to quote from that: "The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert, in secret agreements, arrived at in secret private meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. If you want to know how secretive they are, not even prime ministers, presidents, secretaries of finance, or finance ministers are allowed to attend their meetings, and they keep no minutes. This surreptitious scheme has been very successful in a globalized economy. Even Canadian officials and governments have swallowed it, hook, line, and sinker. Instead of using the Bank of Canada, which we own outright, and which served us so well for 35 years, it helped create the money for the government of Canada to get us out of the Depression. I was there, I know. And then to help fight the war, and we made the fourth largest contribution on the Allied side. And then after the war, to help with the infrastructure requirements of the country, including the St. Lawrence Seaway, Trans-Canada Highway, great new airport terminals, and the U line. The U line, for those of you who are not familiar with it, was the distant early warning line that was put right around the periphery of the continent, most of it being in Canada, so we paid the lion's share of big high-powered radars to watch for Russian planes that might come, or rather Soviet planes at that time, might come across our lines. And to help us establish a really first-class social security system. And all of that was done without the accumulation of any significant amount of debt. Then in 1974, they changed the system. The Bank of Canada abandoned its shareholders and started taking its orders from the BIS in Basel, Switzerland, and it's been downhill ever since. And we've been going into debt. And when my good friend from the US, Ms. Brown, told me how much interest we had paid, I really didn't believe her. I had it checked out by the Parliamentary Research Bureau, and we had, from 1974 fiscal year to 2013-14 fiscal year, paid $1.17 trillion in interest, and all of it unnecessary. If you translate that into US terms, you're talking probably about $13 trillion, which is a lot of money when you get money from somebody who creates it out of nothing, instead of having some of it, at least, created by your own central bank. And now we find ourselves in the position where the Canadian government is trying to pass a Canada infrastructure bill. The Senate almost managed to get further consideration of it, but finally capitulated this last week. And the principal aim of the bill, unstated but true, will be to allow the international banking control to bring back some of their millions or billions of dollars in assets that they've had hidden offshore for the simple reason of not paying taxes, so there would be more taxes left for the rest of us to pay, especially the middle class and the poor, and translate that paper wealth into real assets on the ground by buying or building airports and ports and transportation systems and so on, and getting an annual return of 7 or 9%, while interest rates that you could borrow from are, 1%, 1.5%, 2%. Well, the Minister of Finance, when he was asked why he didn't use the Bank of Canada, said, and I quote, "It would be excessively inflationary." That upset me because it wasn't true. I can't stand people lying in people's face. And so I wrote him a letter. He said this in the House of Commons in response to a question that had been put to him in the Commons. I wrote him a letter and said that wasn't true, it was a lie, and under British parliamentary rules, he should resign, because ministers are not supposed to lie in the House of Commons. And I proved the case in the long letter that I sent him, along with a lot of Canadian monetary history that he probably was unaware of. So in any event, that's the direction we're moving at the present time financially, and it's one that's going to lead to continued austerity and increasing debt, period. And the U.S. is even worse off because a little over 100 years ago, the Congress gave the American birthright to create its money to a handful of the richest bankers in the world. And the Fed has been ripping off the U.S. and the world ever since, and will continue to do so as long as it exists. The result? Americans have become slaves to Wall Street and the European banks that own the Fed. I saw on YouTube this week by Robert Reich, former Labor Secretary, I think he was, if I remember correctly. And if you get a chance to see it, it's worth watching. And he has his blackboard there and does the little paintings that you do. And the president not only cut taxes for the rich, which means a heavier burden for the others, but he now is allowing the bankers to do exactly what I was just describing in the U.S., to go out and build the infrastructure and to get a very generous return on it. It's not new. It's been tried in Greece, where, Lord permitting, I will go tomorrow, and it didn't work. They have a lot of infrastructure they don't use, and they have a lot of debt that they can't pay. Now that's the system that is now being imposed on the U.S. and Canada. Well, the other means of gaining control and dominance has been trade agreements. It started with a free trade agreement between Canada and the U.S. Canada wanted just two things: the exemption from U.S. dumping and anti-subsidy laws, and a gradual phase-in, indeed a back-end loading of tariff eliminations. The U.S. had two demands: immediate abolition of the infamous former Foreign Investment Review Board, and a faster implementation of tariff reductions, given the facts that Canadian tariffs were already higher than the U.S. tariffs. In the end, the Americans achieved both of their demands, and Canada struck out on both of its. The numbers looked okay because we were selling more to the United States, largely energy, for which there was an insatiable demand. And the auto pact helped because there were moving parts of cars back and forth across the border, and every time they crossed the border, they counted in the figures. And finally, the farmers did their thing and started exporting more, but the bottom line was that their net return did not improve a bit. So figures lie, and sometimes so do our newspapers. NAFTA, free trade on steroids. I can say unequivocally, 3 cheers to Donald Trump for saying that NAFTA was a bum deal. It's considered that way by all 3 countries, but certainly Canada and the United States. And finally, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was going to be the mother lode of them all. And if it had gone along, or if it comes back out of the ashes, it transfers so much power from the people to transnational corporations that you can just forget about any democracy in the future. So I would say the president gets full marks on saying just exactly what that was all about and saying to scrap it. Well, everything, of course, is pretty well on course for the cabal and the New World Order. Until 2016, the presidential elections, normally, the cabal had one candidate on each side, someone they could control and who wouldn't start improvising too much. And all of a sudden, they had an election where they only had a candidate on one side, because the candidate on the other side had beaten all of the candidates who might have been acceptable to the cabal. And Hillary Clinton was okay, so Donald Trump was a loose cannon. The cabal was in shock. Trump regaled the press for being unfair, and they were. According to Daniel Estulin, the writer of the book, The True Story of the Bilderbergers, every major news outlet, both print and electronic, in the world, in the English language, is either owned by or controlled by a Bilderberger. His latest books list them all if you want to get a copy of it and check exactly who they are. So they did everything possible to support Hillary and to defeat Trump. And the Russians, who had been convinced that the US might be preparing to attack, did what they could to elect somebody that wouldn't, that would be more favorable to them. The whole idea of a war between the US and Russia is totally insane. But there have been people in the Pentagon who, ever since World War II, have wanted to try that out for size. And there are psychotic generals there today who actually believe that they could start a war with Russia, win it, and walk away to tell the tale. If they believe that, you know where they should be. Because the Russians know too, and they're all prepared, and if it ever did happen, there are tens of millions of people in the United States who would die. If it got bad enough, it might affect the viability of the whole planet as a home for the human species. So I can understand why the Russians thought a Trump victory might be favorable to them, and especially compared to Clinton, who might just have rubber-stamped a plan from the Pentagon to do a first strike. Well, I must admit that I had a very hearty chuckle when the American politicians and press took umbrage at outside interference in their election. I don't go into hysterics easily, but that was about as close as I've come in a long while. The CIA has been doing that in country after country after country for 60 years, and all of a sudden the chickens come home to the roost. This is a terrible thing, you're interfering in our democracy. And whether there was collusion or not between the Trump campaign and Russia, we don't know. But there was between the Canadian Liberals and the US in 1963 because I was part of it. So I know how it works. And it worked, just like it worked down there. So all we know is that the cabal is out to get Trump. And most of the U.S. intelligence agencies, not all, there are lots of great people, but most of the U.S. intelligence agencies, on balance, support the cabal in their New World Order. In some areas, it is difficult to gauge how President Trump is doing. But in one of the most important areas, U.S. relations with the Muslim world, he has managed to pour gasoline on the glowing embers. His attempt to ban the whole group of people with Islamic majorities is a tragedy of the worst order. And because the U.S. is largely responsible in the first place, the plan of the U.S. military-industrial complex has been a continuous war. My friend Carol Rosin, who worked with Wernher von Braun, the rocket scientist, and was a spokesman for him, and Carol said that in his last years, he said they have to have an enemy in order to justify these insanely large military expenditures. And so first it will be the communists, then it will be the terrorists, and then it will be the ETs. And that, of course, is the way that it seems to be working out. But when the Cold War ended, there weren't enough terrorists to warrant a war. And there could have been even fewer if George W. Bush had listened to Osama bin Laden. And I won't read here what Osama said because I'm going to run out of time. But he said, in effect, that he wanted a just settlement of the Palestinian situation, I underline just, and the removal of foreign troops from the peninsula of Muhammad. In other words, what they consider holy ground. And he swore to God that the U.S. would not have peace until those things happened. Well, that is clear enough. The dislike of America had nothing to do with democracy versus dictatorship, or wealth, or freedom of religion and assembly. It directly related to America's foot-dragging and stick-handling a just settlement of the Palestinian question, while continuing to meddle in Middle Eastern affairs, including the station of troops on what was believed to be sacred soil to Islam. In short, American foreign policy was the root of the conflict. But instead, President Bush didn't listen to Osama, but he did listen to Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, who both came from the Pentagon and were authors, along with others, of the plan for a new American century, which was all part of this plan. And they only had a few countries they wanted to attack, and they all happened to be in the Middle East. And they were looking for something which they said was comparable to Pearl Harbor in order to get the American people behind them in that kind of an attack. So you got 9/11. It was one of the greatest deceptions in the history of the world. The Bush administration knew weeks in advance that it was going to happen, did absolutely nothing to stop it. In fact, they were involved. And it did accomplish what the people from the Pentagon wanted to accomplish, which that was an excuse to go to war. And they picked Iraq, of course, which had nothing to do with 9/11. And you know, anybody who believes that two little planes could come over and have the thermal energy or the kinetic energy to take down not two towers, not even three, but what, 5 or 7 altogether? You can read about that in my book, The Money Mafia. The evidence is all there, and they're all preconditioned for demolition. And not only that, but as Dr. Judy Wood says, and I quote her in the book, a new weapon that you should know about. It's like, what does anybody here remember Buck Rogers in the 25th century? A few of you do. The disintegrators? It was a disintegrator. And the disintegrator that they used, or whatever, pulverized both the steel and the concrete before it hit the ground. You should read about it. The result, of course, of going to war with Iraq proved to be disastrous because they kicked out a Sunni minority, at least that was providing peace in the area. and put in a Shia majority who then treated the Sunni minority without mercy, and that resulted ultimately in ISIS, the situation that we're in today. Well, the last thing in the world that we needed was a travel ban in order to exacerbate this unhappy feeling of distrust on both sides. And somehow one of our things that we have to do in the days to come is to try and overcome that kind of distrust and realize that we're all children of God and we have to live together and work together peacefully. An area where I was hoping for some positive action from the new president was our fraudulent banking and financial system. As most of you who have heard me speak know that it's just one giant Ponzi scheme. And it's rotten to the core. If you want some proof of that, don't take my word for it. Read Lucifer's Bankers by Bradley C. Birkenfeld, a new book which describes in plain print how the banks have seduced rich people to put their money offshore and not pay taxes on it. You won't find it the kind of reading you'll like, but it's the kind of reading you should do if you want to know just how rotten the banking system really is. And briefly, a banking system that started out being able to lend the same money twice and get interest from two different people, maybe when the Bank of England was first chartered, reached the stage under Milton Friedman and deregulation where they're lending the same money to 20 different people and collecting interest from 20 different people, organizations, or governments all at the same time. Put another way, they're taking 95% off the top. We had an investigation here recently in Montreal about the Sicilian mafia that were taking 2.5% off the top of city contracts. Here's the banking system taking 95% off the top of every loan they make. And one of the two things that can tame the cabal is a massive change in banking. We have to change the balance of power. And there's only one way, and that is government-created debt-free money. A massive infusion. And Canada should be leading the way instead of sitting on the sidelines. Because we have done it. We know it works. We own our bank, and we could start it in about 2 weeks if we had a government that would read our history and then accept the responsibility we have to Canadians and to the world to show what has to be done. The present cartel is like a snake. It gets a country like this, it winds around it, whoops, until it strangles it. And that's what happens to one country after another, including the European Union. And the only way to loosen the grip of a snake is to cut its head off. And the only way you can do that is for governments to accept their responsibility, not to print all of the money. I have never suggested that, and you can read my books, you can find out what I think. But to do part of it, enough, so that governments have enough money to do the things that are essential for the needs of the people. And this is becoming more and more necessary all the time as we have artificial intelligence and robots, not rabbits, not robots, to do the work for us. I was reading something the other day where robots are going to eliminate 50% of the employment in an industry. Huge. Well, what are the other people going to do? There won't be enough tax money to support them. And so there's something for them to do if we get the government in the money creation business so they have some flexibility, and that is to restore our beautiful planet, to undo the damage that we've done to it, to provide more health care, old age pensions, to look after people who need help, whether it's the old or the disadvantaged, students who have problems. There are all kinds of positive things to do, but they mean government expenditures and not money that's going to come from private enterprise, and that's the reason we have to get the system changed. And I guess one of the reasons that more hasn't happened in the U.S. is because one of the members of the cabinet is a former partner at Goldman Sachs. And he was a major fundraiser, and that's enough to make anyone cynical about politics. But the other thing is the reduction in military expenses. I know my time is just about up, so I'm going to race along here. And we're going in the wrong direction. I have a U.S. friend who says, well, they have to replace the money, the armaments that they've used in the Middle East. And I say we should go in the opposite direction. And now, an issue that concerned me when I went public in 2005 has come true. I was afraid that we might have the United States Air Force tackling some ships from outside the planet, and that wasn't possible for years because we didn't have the technology. But now they do, and they're starting to shoot down alien ships, and we don't know whose. And we don't know what the likely consequences are. And I know this. I have a picture I got the other day well, not the other day, a while ago, of an alien ship being lifted out of the ocean by the United States Navy. And so we must sign the treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space. This treaty is the most important document of our time. And two things are paramount. The U.S. must recognize that war is obsolete. It can't be fought, not successfully, and start sharing power with China and Russia. And all countries must change their priorities from spending more on armaments to spending less, and changing priorities in favor of peaceful and humanitarian pursuits. Global warming is out of control, and we're building pipelines that can only be amortized in 30 to 50 years, and we're fracking and we're drilling more in the ocean. We must be suicidal. We're out of our minds. Our only war should be a war to save our planet. And this is possible. In my book, I said we had 4 years, well, one of the books, 10 years, now 7 years, to win this war. We have the technology. The technology for cold fusion exists. We don't have to invent it. It's there. All we have to do is take it and do the obverse of what we did in World War II. In World War II, we took every automobile plant in the continent and every refrigerator plant and every washing machine plant, and we converted them into armaments. And this made it possible to win the war. Today we have to do the exact opposite and take those armaments plants who are keeping the wars going and convert them into plants to make those little boxes, cold, of zero-point energy, that you can put in your car or your tractor or your truck or your airplane or your ship or your home and provide all the power you need. And it would employ millions and millions of people. It is the only way that Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau can keep their promises as far as jobs are concerned. There is no other way. There's nothing on the horizon which would come close to it. So we have to change the banking system, which would provide us with the money to finance the zero-point revolution that is necessary for the future of our planet and of our species. Well, of the species in particular. I think the planet might survive. So one has to be a little bit sympathetic to Trump. The cabal was determined to stop him, and now they're out to get him. So it will be difficult to define the cabal, but it must be done, as my book argues. Congress must rescind or at least suspend the National Security Act so we can get the truth out, because there are thousands of people there, honest people, who want to tell the truth and let us know what's happening. But the penalties at the moment are just so great that they can't take that risk. The cabal, in my opinion, is very corrupt, and as Dr. Stephen Greer's book, Unacknowledged, proves it conclusively, and he will be speaking to us in just a few minutes. In the end, it is a moral and spiritual battle led by the West, led by the US, worships the wrong gods. We have to turn back to the Creator and His wishes for our planet and our people, to change the balance of power in favor of the poor, the unemployed, the sick, and the disadvantaged. Is this possible? Yes. Is it probable? That depends entirely on us as individuals. We are writing our own histories, and we will get what we produce. Thank you very much.
Whole cover-up from the very beginning. They have one of the finest national security intelligence operations on the planet. I mean, a retired Soviet KBG general by the name of Oleg Kalugin, who is now living in Washington, D.C., and he's an advisor and some of our people in government. Oleg Kalugin said, if we had had the intelligence operations in the Soviet Union as good as the one at the Vatican, the Cold War would still be going on. The Berlin Wall would have not fallen, and the Soviet Union would still exist. He says, we always knew that the best damn security intelligence operation on the planet was out of the Vatican. And probably the reason is that every damn priest in every country on the planet, Catholic priest, is in a sense an agent of the Vatican Intelligence Secret Service. And they're deeply concerned about the location and the appearance in our solar system of a planet known as NIBIRU, which has already been photographed, and I have a picture of it here in a moment to share with you. The 10th planet has been photographed by an astro, what do they call them, where the telescopes are? Well, anyhow, they've taken pictures of the damn thing in southern Chile because it has appeared below the ecliptic in the southern hemisphere. It's already been photographed by at least 3 cameras and telescopes. It's one of the biggest secrets in our government today. The reality and the presence of the 10th planet. Our government has known about it since 1980. Anyhow, it's real, it's there, and we're going to see it up here. I've been involved in this whole thing for 40 years, and I've been deeply involved in it for the last 20. And let me tell you, take it for what it's worth, in my view, there ain't going to be no disclosure. Not like they expect. They expect the government to someday have a news conference and stand up and say, hey, we got a little surprise for you. Guess what? We've been keeping it from you. We're sorry about that, but it was for your own good, you know. You guys weren't ready for this. You probably couldn't handle it. So, but now we're going to tell you, oh yes, aliens are here. They've been here for quite a while. They're all over the place. Well, they are indeed all over the damn place. But you're not going to get a government disclosure because that's not how government works. First of all, they're a bunch of nitwits in some cases. They're not capable of giving you a disclosure and doing it in a sensible, thoughtful, caring way. For a lot of reasons. One of the reasons is that they don't want to admit to you they've been lying to you for over 60 years. And then the other thing is that they are really a little bit uncertain and frightened themselves because the true scope of their awareness and what they know still has them in a state of shock. An event took place in California in 1954 at an Air Force base known as Muroc. This event had been planned and orchestrated by sensitive military, primarily naval individuals. And what it was essentially is that Eisenhower got aboard his plane, went out to this Muroc Air Force Base with a whole passel of guys from his administration, and including the Archbishop or Cardinal or Bishop of Los Angeles, a guy by the name of McIntyre. And this thing had been orchestrated and organized for some time because there had been communications between individuals in naval intelligence. And I say naval, and I say this again and again and again. My kid retired as a senior officer from the Navy just in November. The Navy has been up to here, this whole program from the very beginning, and they actually run the operation over at Groom Lake at S4. Anyhow, this event took place. I've had verification and proof that it actually transpired from sources impeccable. They flew Ike out there. Supposedly he was visiting a dentist. He had a problem. Well, bless his heart, he really did have a problem. When this was over, he ended up having a coronary. That impact upon him was so powerful that he ended up having a heart attack. Anyhow, what transpired in April of 1954? A group of others, I hate the word alien, I don't even like the word ETs, but whatever term you care to use, they came in. There were 3 ships. They were golden in color. They were discs primarily, circular discs, but they were fat discs. They had a high dome on the top and they had a big dome on the bottom. And these golden metallic discs came in, 3 of them, and they circled over the runway. Made several passes. And Ike and this whole crowd are standing there with, mouths dropping open. We had some generals, we had some admirals, and we had a couple of church authorities there, and poor old Ike. And these guys circled around for a time, and then one of the ships came in and landed on the tarmac right in front of the hangar where the receiving party, the welcoming party, was located. And they had cameras set up. There were at least 4, maybe 5 cameras. Everything was on film. All of the sounds, they picked up every word that was said. One of the ships come over and lands right in front of the hangar. The other 2 ships stayed hovering over the runway during the entire process. The stories I've heard from people I trust in that the whole thing went 3 days. There was a lot of exchange. And your country hasn't been the same since. You talk about black government, shadow government. Ladies and gentlemen, you have no idea how damn black it is. The government you think you got is not the government you've got. The government you think you had, the government that Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Hamilton, all the rest of those guys created 200 years ago is not the government you've got today. You do not have a democratic republic, good people, and I'm sorry to have to tell you that. You all know about Roswell. Well, let me tell you, Roswell was one little tiny event. For God's sake, there were 3 crashes in that area in New Mexico within 30 days. Roswell was only a tiny piece of it. There have been crashes going on all over the country and all around the world for the last 40 years, 60 years. We've been picking up bits and pieces of hardware all over the damn planet. The Navy retrieved a UFO out of the waters off San Diego in 1941. And if you talk about parts, well, we picked up bits and pieces. Ooh, we loaded them up. We took them off here and we took them off there. Took them at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. We've taken them at several places. And then, God bless them, we've taken the bodies and a couple of survivors off as well. Well, that's ancient history. But I'm saying, forgive me if I repeat myself, your government that you thought you had ceased to exist in 1947. And 1947 was also a year where we created the Central Intelligence Agency, we created the National Security Organization, and we also signed a pact called the UKUSA Pact, UK-USA. Now, this pact we signed in 1947 was not just an accident. At the end of World War II, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States signed this pact, and we have been like this ever since. But the people in the United Kingdom, in England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, they don't know any more about it in reality than most people out there do. Because one of the things about the Yakuza Pact was the lid came down on all the secrets, particularly the secrets of their reality, and the lid has been down ever since. I have to laugh sometimes when I hear Nick Pope speaking out. Many of you know who Nick Pope is. He's a delightful young man. He's a bright young man. He worked for the Ministry of Defense in Britain for a number of years, and he had the UFO desk. And Nick is a lot like some of our people. They sit at the desk and they see a little bit, but they don't see most of it, because most of it never got to Nick's desk. So when he tells you that everything's been released, we're releasing it all over the place. Oh yeah, France has been releasing their classified material. The United Kingdom has been releasing their classified material, and the U.S. has begun releasing little bits and pieces of it. If you think they're releasing anything of real importance, forget it. The stuff that they're releasing is garbage. Nick, forgive me wherever you are at this moment. I'm not putting you down. Most of the stuff they're releasing is garbage. The only bit of information that came out of France recently that was of any information or of any value was a report they called the COMMENT report. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that. A number of retired French admirals and generals and scientists got together and put together a 30 or 40-page document called the COMMENT report about what they considered to be the reality of the extraterrestrial presence, which is a term I like to repeat from time to time, the UFO matter. And the COMMENT report said essentially that, damn it, we're not being told the truth, and we think it's time for everybody to fess up and get this information out. And the French were really ticked because, you know, they've had a chip on their shoulder from the very beginning that they've never really been shared with by the United Kingdom and the United States. So Washington was not sending anything to shape headquarters about the UFO matter, where these things were flying all over Central Europe back then. Gordon Cooper admitted to me, he said, you know, I was flying jet fighters over Europe in the 50s, and they were all over the damn place. We wondered then what they were all about. Well, bless his heart, Gordon now knows the answer. Oh, where were we? I was rambling, excuse me. We were talking about disclosure. There are lots of different things that have been happening. Let me get to some of this material here. One of the things that ticked me off the most is a little document known as Executive Order. I have in my fingers, I sound like one of those guys on TV. I have in my greasy fingers here an Executive Order. Copy of it. This was signed by Slick Willie. Oh, excuse me, President Clinton. Slick Willie signed this on September the 29th, 1995. An executive order is something that you may not be aware of. An executive order is probably the most powerful piece of paper there is in our government. A president sits down, comes up with an idea, he has something he wants to do, he puts it on paper, he signs it, that becomes law. Nobody in Congress has to talk about it, nobody in Congress is asked to see it, nobody in Congress has to give approval to this, because when the president signs it, it becomes law. Now that in itself good God, Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, those guys are spinning in their graves, I think. The fact that we've reached this point where an imperial president can sit in his office at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and sign an executive order which becomes the law of the land, and you cannot argue with it. This particular one that Clinton signed in September of '95 wiped away every rule in the Environmental Protection Act. There were a bunch of guys over here, not too far away, at Groom Lake, Site 51, who were dying horrible deaths because they had been exposed to something, smoke, chemical, whatever, during their job. And these guys, their flesh was falling off their bodies. Their skin was rupturing. The flesh was falling. They were in incredible pain, and they were dying. And their doctors and some attorneys tried to find out what it was that was causing this. If the doctors could find out what was causing it, they could possibly help those guys deal with this, and they could come up with some way of treating them. Well, not only did the government deny the request for information on what that material was that was killing these guys, those bastards in Washington even denied the damn facility didn't even exist. And this is after the Soviets had taken photographs from orbit proving the existence of Groom Lake and Site 51. And the Soviets were good enough to let us have photographs of the damn place. And yet your government in Washington says, oh, that doesn't exist. That place doesn't exist. No. And they wouldn't share any information, and those guys continued to die. I don't know how many of them passed away. I've lost track of it over the years. Let me tell you one other small thing. A retired scientist by the name of David Froning, who is alive and well and living outside of Flagstaff, Arizona today. 15 years ago, David Froning spoke at a conference which I was part of. And Froning graduated or completed his career working for Lockheed Martin, this vast corporation that's got their sticky fingers in so damn many things. David told us at this conference 15 years ago that before he retired, Lockheed Martin had, well, how the word he is, they had developed and were using hyperluminal flight. And it took some of us a little bit of a side there, and David, hyperluminal flight. Yeah, he said, faster than light. They've had it 40 years. Who has it? Well, he says, I want to say your government, but I can't say that with all honesty because he says it's classified. We've had hyperluminal flight for years, and you may know about it in another 20, 30 years when they fess up and tell you that what they can do, and what they've accomplished, and what they can do, and what they have done. Now, another little tiny tidbit. This was from David Froning, a respected man, a scientist who spent all those years. Froning was involved with what he called modified field propulsion, a variable field form of propulsion. They were dealing with matter-antimatter conversion. They called it exotic field tension. And he said flatly, it modifies time and space. And it ends up, we've got transluminal, hyperluminal flight. Now, some years ago, a guy by the name of Ben Rich retired from Lockheed Martin. And in the end of his career, Ben ran the skunk works over there at Lockheed. And there was a little jovial exchange between him and the guys in the audience out there. And Ben Rich said, you know, we can take E.T. home. I think the E.T. movie was out about that time. He says, we can take E.T. home. And a few of the guys in the audience says, Ben, what the hell are you talking about? Oh, he said, let me tell you, we've got stuff you wouldn't believe. We can take extraterrestrial home. So they said, look, what the hell is it all about? He goes over to the blackboard and he writes, unfunded opportunities. Okay. Well, the guys say, well, what the hell does that mean, Ben? Unfunded opportunities. So he goes over with the chalk and he circles the U and the F and the O. UFO. And then he had a big grin on his face and he left the podium. So we got these little bits and pieces. You talk about leakage. Arthur Clarke used to say, if you see advanced technology to a degree that's beyond what you can understand, people consider it as magic. Well, this is magic, guys. This was photographed in the infrared, and this is a city under the surface of Mars the size of Chicago. It's generating an enormous amount of heat. I'm sorry about the details of it are not that clear, but you can see the streets blocks. This is an underground city on Mars that's fully active and filled with God knows who and what. Next picture, please. That's Phobos. That's the moon, 12 miles in diameter. The Soviets planned to land on it. Well, someone else said, no, you're not going to do that. But that is a picture of Phobos, which they've all concluded is an artificial satellite. Big secret? So's our own. Next picture. This photograph was taken by your own NASA Apollo 13 guys on their trip to the moon that didn't work out too well. And many of you may have heard rumors about the story, but Apollo 13 had a small nuclear device aboard. And they had been told by the guys that ran NASA that they were going to land on the surface, going to place this small nuclear device. And then when they all left and came back aboard and came back, they were going to detonate it and study the reverberations of this nuclear device, study the seismology of the moon, because they've been convinced for some years that the moon is basically hollow. It appears to be somewhat of an artificial satellite. Well, they plan to detonate this nuclear device, and the others said, no, you're not going to do that. We'll get back to that picture again, please. All right, I wanted to show you. This picture was taken by Apollo 13. The object you see there in the middle is 5 miles long. It's an artificial, I assume metallic object, probably crammed with guys. And that object followed our Apollo 13 all the way to the moon, around and back. Now, whether they were trying to make sure the Apollo 13 guys got home safely or what, whether they were the ones responsible for Apollo 13's little accident, which kept them from landing on the moon and placing that nuclear device, who knows? We may find out someday. But here you have an artificial object in orbit on the way to the moon, 5 miles long. Now, I've spent some time aboard aircraft carriers with my kid. I've been invited several times. My boy served on 4 different carriers, nuclear-powered Nimitz-class carriers. We have carriers with 5,000 men in the crew, 1,000 feet long, 150 aircraft. There's snack bars, dining rooms, accommodations, this and that. Can you imagine the accommodations on an object? I like to think that, there's McDonald's, bowling alleys, God knows what. I'm sure they have a fairly good life out there. Anyhow, aboard an object 5 miles long, I've tried, in the time I had, to do two things. To impress upon you the reality of the extraterrestrial presence, the ones I refer to as the others. I hate the term alien, I hate the term UFO. There are no UFOs. We've known what they are for years and years and years. Some of them are ours, some of them are theirs. There are no unidentified flying objects out there. They're all identified. I've tried to impress upon you the seriousness of it, the seriousness of the cover-up and the lies they've been telling you. The importance of why you need to know as much as you can know. And you need to be presented with the material because, damn it, you all deserve the truth. You have a right to know and you have a need to know because you are the people that this whole damn thing is all about. Now, they're in our midst. That's an understatement. When I came in, I arrived yesterday. I've been running around here all day. There's an old friend sitting in the audience out here who I've known for years. He's currently with Defense Intelligence Agency. He's getting up to years, probably going to retire very soon. And I've met him many times. We've shared a lot of information. There is another young man in the audience here who I will not point to because I can't see a damn thing with those lights, who is from National Security Agency, and he and my old friend were not aware of the other one being present here. But the one that's most redeeming and most exciting for me is there is a couple here who look like they're in the mid-40s. They look like a husband and wife. Nice-looking people. Very nicely appearance. As I said, their appearance is like a husband and wife. They're sitting together. Neither one of them were born on this planet. Guys, they're in your midst. If you have dinner down here somewhere, if you have dinner down here somewhere, you could be sitting next to one of them. There are two of them in the audience this afternoon, and I want to salute you. They're nice folks. They're as human in most respects as you and I are. They're all over the damn place. They're in our midst, and they are family. We're related to them because they were the ones that had a hand in establishing us as a hybrid race 100,000 years ago. And that hybridization is still underway. It's still happening even as we sit here and speak. And it's simply this: you're not alone, and you have never been alone. And you have had, as I have learned over the years, an intimate interrelationship with advanced extraterrestrial intelligence from the beginning of human history. But what the thing I've learned, I guess, the most powerful thing, is that there is a God. Don't you ever doubt that. There is a supreme being. And you're all a part of that because there is a spark of that divinity flashing and burning in every one of you. It's known as your soul, your immortal soul. I want to say something in closing. I want to try to communicate to you how much you people have meant to me over the years. I want you to know how much you all have meant to me over the years. Your support, your encouragement, and your warmth is only the one thing that's kept me going. I want you to know how grateful I am to each and every one of you. You are friends. Ti amo. I love you all. Good night.